In 1996, the survival horror video game genre was forever changed with the release of Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1. As subsequent titles released, fans grew more and more hungry to see their favorite zombie blasting franchise move to the silver screen. Unfortunately, time and time again, directors and film studios have gotten the Resi recipe all wrong. With the recent release of The Last of Us on HBO Max, I thought it right to show by how getting The Last of Us so right shows a roadmap for how the Resident Evil franchise itself can start to do the same. To fully appreciate everything that The Last of Us has gotten so right, we have to go look back at the Resident Evil films to figure out what went wrong. In 2002, the first Resident Evil film was released on March the 15th and was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson and distributed by Constantine Film. The movie went on to gross a cool $17 million in its first week and $103 million worldwide. Though it is much maligned by critics, it still boasts a fan score of 67% on Rotten Tomatoes. I am still of the opinion that despite this movie taking its own path and ignoring much of the established story, the movie is and will always be a solid film. The problems for this franchise really started with the introduction of the character Alice, played by Mila Jovovich in this movie. Not because her existence in this movie ruined it or cheapened the experience, but more for the direction it set in motion for the films that followed. The story for the first film goes a little something like this. There's been a T-virus outbreak within the Hive laboratory, and a group of commandos, along with Alice and a man named Matt Addison, have to find a way to seal the facility with the help of a supercomputer known as the Red Queen to stop the outbreak. Now, if that sounds weird and that it has nothing to do with the first title in the Resident Evil video game franchise, it's because it doesn't. This movie and all of the characters in it are new additions and were adapted for this film. This is where the train begins to slightly come off the rails. See, what this film did through its reception by fans and box office numbers was show Paul W.S. Anderson that he could take a well-established franchise, ignore everything in it that makes it unique and loved by fans, and turn it into a run-of-the-mill zombie movie set in the world of Resident Evil. In my opinion, the success of this movie was based solely on the fact that it was the first film to scratch the itch that Resi fans had had for so long to see their beloved franchise get its time in the sun on the big screen. It's like when you're in school and you have a presentation to give. Generally, if you go first, the teacher tends to grade easier on you because they haven't seen everyone else's presentation. Therefore, you are setting the bar for which all presentations after you will be graded on. In this same way, Resident Evil 2002 had the advantage of being the first film to try to make Resident Evil into a movie. Without seeing what anyone else could do with the IP, and with the longing by fans to get a Resident Evil movie, Paul W.S. Anderson and the folks at Constantine Film struck at the exact right moment. Now, I'm not going to get into every one of the 6 movies in the Paul W.S. Anderson cinematic Resident Evil universe because this video would end up being an hour long and we aren't here just to talk about Resident Evil. But before we get to The Last of Us, we must establish what exactly I think Resident Evil movies have gotten wrong specifically. Firstly, they ignored the lore to the point of defiance. To take an unknown character in Alice and make her the titular protagonist in a huge universe of Resident Evil is ridiculous. From Jill Valentine to Leon Kennedy, there are many well-established characters worthy of being the focus in the film franchise. Jill Valentine, for example, was one of the only women ever allowed in Delta Force training and the only woman in the Elite Stars unit within the Raccoon Police Department. Despite this, she and other franchise-defining characters are left on the sidelines in favor of an unknown character. The problem with this is that fans have connections to these characters, and when you sideline them as nothing more than supporting cast, you lose that connection to your films. Take Jill Valentine in Resident Evil Apocalypse, for example. Even though she is, for all intents and purposes, a badass, she is relegated to being a tag-along character you never really get to know much about in the second film. Also look at Leon Kennedy, who, although he has a bigger role in the later films, is still a quote-unquote supporting character. The reason we love video games and why Resident Evil fans love their characters is because we've been to hell and back with them. Whether it's fighting off El Gigante or dodge rolling past Nemesis on the streets of Raccoon City, each fan has their own deep and real passion for the games and the characters they pilot within them. So when you relegate these heroes to a lesser role, you lose the soul of Resident Evil and what it means to so many people. The next issue I take with the Resident Evil films is that what they add to or change about the franchise takes away from the overall Resident Evil experience. For this point, I want to mention one of the films I think got almost everything right about Resident Evil, and that is Welcome to Raccoon City. Welcome to Raccoon City should be seen as an indictment on the Paul W.S. Anderson films. It takes established characters and storylines and almost perfectly balances changes that are needed to adapt a video game into a movie, while also staying mostly true to the source material. In this movie, you have fan favorites like Claire Redfield, Chris Redfield, and Leon Kennedy, to name a few. It was my first time watching a Resident Evil movie and actually enjoying myself since Resident Evil 2002. The characters that it's for so long been an afterthought now had a chance to shine. The Paul W.S. Anderson movies added a lot to the Resident Evil story, but none of it ever felt worthwhile. Oh, now the survival horror film is an action movie that's one bullet dodging sequence away from the Matrix? No thanks. Oh, Nikolai from Resident Evil 3 is now a good guy? I mean, what the hell? Welcome to Raccoon City does away with the overblown theatrics of the mid to late 2000s in exchange for a story that feels scary, a story that feels like survival horror. The movie runs into an issue, though, that I think The Last of Us being a TV show has gotten right, and that is pacing. Welcome to Raccoon City's biggest glaring issue is that it tried to do too much with too little time. It tried to fit 3 games into an hour and 47 minutes, which just doesn't lend itself well to pacing. Overall, the Resident Evil franchise has had a less than perfect run in film. I mean, don't even get me started on the live action Resident Evil show on Netflix, but there is hope, and it comes in the form of The Last of Us. The Last of Us on HBO is a TV series based on a 2013 smash hit video game of the same name made by Naughty Dog. Despite the series only being on its 3rd episode at the time of me writing this, it is already being hailed as one of the best video game adaptations of all time. With that said, let's look at why that is and how those who choose to take a swing at adapting Resident Evil in the future can use this show as a guide on how to get it right. Firstly, it knows that characters are essential to the story that they want to tell, and fan favorites Joel, Tess, and Ellie, just to state the obvious and important ones, are all here. This is how you do a game with a well-known lore and backstory. Take what the source material gives you and cast those who can do the characters justice. Imagine for a second having a Last of Us story without Joel or Ellie as the lead characters, and instead they're replaced by an unknown character who becomes the focal point of the story, while fan favorites are just stand-ins. Lucky for us, the viewer, and any fan of the Last of Us game, that was not the direction that Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann, the creators of the show, took. They did what all good adaptations should and made a concerted effort to not only include characters that have real connections to fans, but they casted some heavy hitters. Pedro Pascal, in my opinion, along with Bella Ramsey, are not just throwaway character selections, but are both almost perfect reflections of their video game counterparts. It's not enough to just look like your video game counterparts, but through 3 episodes, the tenuous relationship between the two has been amazing to watch. Just like the games, they are both feeling each other out in a situation neither of them want to be in, and I, for one, cannot wait to see their relationship develop throughout the season. Next, let's go back to those changes that I was talking about, because The Last of Us certainly has made some. But in the way that I said Resident Evil adds things that lend little to no value to the story, The Last of Us excels in adding things that give an already existing story even more depth. Take Bill for an example. In the game, Bill is a crazy man who has booby-trapped an entire city. You need his help to find a battery for a truck, though there is dialogue to give Bill some depth in the game. At the end of the day, he just isn't that complex, and you don't have the time in the game to explore every detail about him. You must get Ellie out west and keep the story moving. The show, however, dropped a boulder of character development on our heads with Episode 3. In Episode 3, you learn about how Bill managed to have a whole town to himself by hiding in his bunker when the military evacuated everyone. We learn about him meeting Frank and seeing him fall in love with one another. We get to see how love is an act of sacrifice. It's about caring and protecting. At one point, after Frank falls terminally ill, he asks Bill to poison him after one last beautiful day together. In the climax of this episode, Bill does just what Frank asked, but also drugged himself as well so they could die together. Frank is understandably upset with Bill when Bill utters this absolute heartbreaker of a line: "I'm old and I'm satisfied." I mean, is someone cutting onions in here? Holy shit, what was that episode? This might end up being one of the best episodes in TV show history ever, let alone one made about a video game. This is my point, though. Last of Us took a lesser character and created someone that we could relate with, someone we could cry with. Resident Evil takes well-established characters and boils them down into something that only invokes feelings of dread from lack of effort to make franchise mainstays feel deep and important in the Resident Evil universe. Now, with saying all of this, this is by no means gospel. This is, after all, my opinion. But I think it would be an injustice not to mention that because everybody feels differently, and it would be wrong for me to assume all fans feel the same. But in my opinion, if and when Resident Evil makes it back to the silver screen, they need to look at what The Last of Us is doing right now and take notes, because so far it is a masterclass in video game adaptation. Hey everyone, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the content, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.